I am delighted to present to you this morning our guest speaker. She has received her doctorate in counseling psychology with an emphasis in therapy with children and families from the University of Utah. Her teaching and research interests include multicultural counseling, Latinx psychology, and liberation psychology. I want us to get into that liberation psychology. Oh, yes. She is really adept at directing her research to language, culture, and gender. She works with our students with reckless abandonment. Yes, she gives them all that she has. She holds back nothing. That's one of the things that I really like about her. She holds back nothing from the teaching experience. She gives it her all in all. Um, I I am delighted that she is speaking on managing difficult conversations because I think beyond her training, she is one who practices having difficult conversations in a very, very comforting way. And I will and difficult conversations can't always be comfortable, but she manages to make it so. I have admired for the past 6 years, I have admired watching her make a statement, stand on it without flinching, and do it in such a way that you want to do exactly what she has said. It's an amazing thing to watch. I have learned from her, and I am delighted that you this morning get the opportunity to also learn from the one and only Dr. Carrie Castaneda Sound. Dr. Carrie, I
Well, thank
present to
you.
you.
Thank you, Dean Williams. That was a very kind introduction, and I appreciate it. I'm going to have to tell my husband all these things so he knows. um, I am so excited to be here today, and just honored to have been asked to talk and talk with you all about these topics. Um, I just have to say that it's been a lifetime of learning, of growing to get to where I am now. Um, I was the young girl who, as a child, my mom would say, "Go get some ketchup from the." I'll go ask for ketchup. You know, we'd be at McDonald's and we didn't have enough ketchup. She's like, "Go ask them for some more packets." And I would be in tears because I was so shy and so afraid to go up and ask for something, right? And so here I am now teaching, yearly in the last 15 years as a professor, teaching about some of the most difficult topics, teaching and talking about race, ethnicity, um, all the isms, sexism, racism, and so on, and really enjoying it. And so I think one of the things that inspired me is reading about people who open the conversations, um, just to have a conversation, not to control the conversation, but just to have a conversation. And there was a book, I remember in grad school reading, it was called Sitting in the Fire. And I felt like that really kind of describes my experience sometimes in classes, that I'm sitting in the fire and it's a microcosm of society. And I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's more of what motivates me is these are students that are eventually going to be working in the world as therapists, as psychologists. They're going to be the healers. And I need to push them so that they're ready to develop a relationship with the people that sit across from them, the people they work with. So it's asking the questions that we don't typically ask because maybe we were raised to say that's rude to ask, that's rude to bring up. We don't talk about that. I love when I hear that's something we don't talk about, because I love the next question is why not? Why not? So I guess I always come at this with a level of curiosity. How did it get this way? And why do we do this? So I'd like to just do a little activity before we get started. I'm going to ask Vanessa to put a link in the chat box. And it's a link to a survey. So you're going to be taken out of Zoom to directly into a survey where it asks you to put down 3 words that describe how your body felt when either you experienced a difficult dialogue or you witnessed a very difficult conversation, and what was going on in your body. So just 3 words. We're going to see what's called a word cloud to see how we all are similar. If that's something you don't feel comfortable doing, to click on the chat, you can also click on the link. I'm sorry. You can also put in the chat your words if that's something more comfortable. But if you could just click on the link that Vanessa's put in the chat box and then put your 3 words, I'll show you where we're all at. So this is, what are we noticing? This is our body reacting, right, to difficult conversations. And this is based in our physiology, our body, it's our brain working. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. Sometimes I think of difficult conversation as a storm that we're getting into. And I think as we, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Utah, I lived all over the states, and storms can look different in different states and different settings. And I think these difficult conversations can look different with different people. It can feel angry with some people. It can feel emotionally draining with others, with tears. It can feel so different, right? With people bring up different feelings from us. So I think part of this talk today is going to be more about learning about ourselves. How do we react in relationship to others? I do want to say that when I teach this class, often in the class, we'll sit down as a class and say, okay, what are some ground rules if we're going to have these conversations, right? And students will come up with a long list of ground rules that they'd like to have happen in the classroom. And what we inevitably find out is what makes one person feel safe might be threatening to another person. And so our ground rules are even complicated because someone says, I just need space to stop and think and take a break. And the other person might say, well, to me, that feels like you're disengaging it and just judging me or what have you. And so it's very interesting how this is nuanced for every person. We can't always plan on these ground rules in our daily lives. And I think my talk today is going to be geared more to those we care about. Sometimes these opportunities show up in family gatherings or even at work, people we have to see daily. And we can see them as stressors. We can also see them as opportunities. But I think that it's important to say that this is going to look different for every person and every topic. There's different ways of conceptualizing this. Some people call them brave conversations, difficult conversations, and some even call them constructive conversations. So I think all of these have different meanings for the people who name them. So I think that's another thing we're going to unpack today. The Dalai Lama said, a tree with strong roots can withstand the most violent storm, but the tree can't grow roots just as a storm appears on the horizon. Like I said, I see this as a lifetime of learning. I think we all learn a little bit and practice with some of these dialogues. Some of us have been doing this daily for all our lives, and it's something that we've had to experience. And maybe this is because of our identities in the world that we might be targeted for some of these identities. So we always are feeling like, oh, I have to explain again, or, oh, this is going to be another difficult conversation. So I think this looks different and for all of us in our experiences of having them. But I will say that what I love about this quote is we have to realize that we're in a growth process, and we have to realize we need to grow deep roots and understand what those are, and by being proactive in this process. So what contributes to these strong roots? There's a lot of things in this small amount of time. I really want to talk about our intrapersonal skills, like what do we do for ourselves that helps us grow these roots? What do we do in our skills of interacting with others? And finally, what about our faith and spirituality? How does that guide us in this process? So those are the three things I wanted to focus on today. I'm going to tell you right now, I think Therapist 101 is that we can't change other people. And that's a hard thing to sometimes accept. But we can change ourselves. That's within our control, right? So that's what I'm really focusing more on. What do we know about ourselves and what can we change? Another caveat is that often these difficult dialogues don't go well over social media. They just don't. Um, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, these are typically not sources of really deep, difficult conversations. They're just blasts of thoughts, right? And going back and forth. And I think that, if you can, find platforms where this can go deeper and you feel like you're really connecting, that's great. But usually it's with people who think like you or somewhat closer to thinking like you. So it's more of when you're a little bit more polarized, these difficult dialogues become much more challenging. So I would say that having a very a difficult dialogue conversation isn't something that should be happening over social media. Okay, so interpersonal. What is it about myself that I need to know? And this involves some self-awareness and self-reflection, understanding how do we regulate our own emotions, how do we engage in patience, how do we find courage and wisdom in this process. So I'm just going to share a little bit about our self-awareness, okay, and self-reflection. Many of us have very different experiences with difficult dialogues and conversation, and we would like to find tools and tips to make them not as difficult, but that would make an oxymoron. It's difficult for a reason. It's uncomfortable for a reason. And so what we need to do is find ways to sit in the discomfort and tolerate it to an amount that is acceptable for us. I don't say that we need to be martyrs and go sit in difficult dialogues that are hurtful to us. I don't think that's necessarily a helpful thing, but we need to be mindful about what are we getting into and why. And like I said before, we have varying degrees of experience with difficult conversations. I was amazed by one student who told me growing up at the dinner table, a common practice was for her family to debate issues. And it was very normalized to have these mini debates at the dinner table. And I was just in awe of that because she was very calm in talking about difficult issues. But she did have a mode of debate mode, like I'm going to win this conversation, which is very off-putting to many of the people's that she was talking with in class. And she was really confused by why are people getting mad at me when I'm sharing my the knowledge I have. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a sec too. We also have different circumstances, meaning different people, different topics, and our own history, which makes certain conversations more difficult. So let me give you an example. I have a close friend who, at my daughter's soccer practice, we do our exercise and walk around the soccer field many times and talk and chat and have a great time. Unfortunately, in about June or July, we were walking and we had our masks on and social distancing while we were walking. And she started talking about how she didn't believe in COVID. She thought it wasn't real. And she was talking about how the conspiracy theories around that. And in that moment, due to my own experience, my own history, I had just lost two friends. My husband had just lost his best friend and his cousin. I knew I couldn't engage in a difficult dialogue about this. I couldn't talk to her about that. And so I honestly said to her, I said, Mariela, I said, I don't think I can talk about this right now. And she's like, why? And so I shared with her my experiences, and I'm in grief. I'm struggling right now. So I don't think any conversation about conspiracy theories is going to go over really well. So in that moment, we had a very strong relationship first off, but I had to share with her, be a little vulnerable and share with her some of my experiences in that moment. And three was that I had to trust that she would honor, right? Honor my request of saying, can we just not talk about this right now? I'm just not emotionally in a place. And she understood. And then we just talked about she just didn't want to lose our connection, which we didn't. We haven't. And it just was an experience of my own history, and that I just wasn't able to do that at that moment. Um, we have these physiological reactions, um, but we also in the moment might experience these primary emotions of fear, anxiety, sadness, disgust, even, which could lead to secondary emotions such as guilt, shame, and confusion. These secondary emotions are reactions to our primary emotions and are often thought of as attitudes. So these secondary emotions might contribute to thoughts like, "Oh, they're not going to like me if they really knew what I thought," or "Gosh, how could they believe that? They're a horrible person and really disgusted," right? So it's this emotional interaction with our thoughts that I think is most fascinating to me. Is how did I get to this place, and how can I kind of reverse engineer it to understand what did this bring up for me. This is a level of self-awareness that helps me engage in these difficult dialogues. I think it's important when we're talking about this to not decontextualize it, meaning that in some settings there are serious consequences for things we say, things we believe, and stances we take. So the issues of power. What is the consequences if this conversation goes poorly? Whether it's for me and my status or the status of the person I'm interacting with. So it's particularly in a work setting. Is this something that is it a setting that allows for these type of discussions and conversations or not? I also like to think of what are the benefits? In what ways might this deepen our relationship and bring us closer? Um, another example is my brother and I are completely different on almost every way you can imagine. But he's my brother. We've grown up together. It's a blended family. We are different racially, ethnically, gender, politically, education. I'm the only in my family to have gone to college. Um, just so different. But I love him. He's my brother. We grew up to it with each other, right? Like he's the one who teased me. He's the one who looked after me. And so I went last week on Thursday on a 7-hour drive with him to Arizona, 6-hour drive to Arizona. And I thought, I'm going to be locked in a car with him for, for 7 hours on the week of the election results. Is this something I should be doing? And I think when we both did that, we knew we're putting our relationship on the line. And what am I willing to do to make this work? And we had some amazing conversations. Now, the benefits really outweighed the consequences in that sense. The benefits were that we have a deeper respect. There were moments of where he said, "Oh, I hadn't thought about it in that way." That's when I feel like we're connecting on a different level. The consequences were honestly draining, I think, for both of us. We were exhausted. There was a lot of awareness going on, not just of what we were talking about, but the process. Okay, so we were exhausted after that trip, but the benefits, I think, outweighed the consequences. When we first, talked initially about what happens to our body when we're about to undergo a difficult conversation, there is a neurobiology of the stress reaction, right? The sweaty palms and so on. And when we feel under attack, the brain and our central nervous system releases these hormones designed to keep us hypervigilant. It's this fight, flight, or freeze mode. And this is how we were designed, right, to survive. Now, the piece is that when this happens, our prefrontal cortex, which is usually in charge in our rational thinking part, and organizes and reflects, it's creative. This kind of becomes flooded and it just shuts down basically. So when we're in this fight, flight, freeze, and there's more, but we can't access our thinking brain in the same way. We're unable to really listen and learn. We shut down, we become paralyzed, and we're not receptive to new information. So when you think about it, this is counterproductive to a constructive exchange or just even a thoughtful exchange. So when we're under this place of stress, deep stress, physiological stress, we move to our more characteristic ways of responding, and just have this kind of either running away. You might be the one who just I gotta leave, or you freeze and clam up. I'm that one. I kind of freeze and clam up, get really quiet, or I fight. It depends on the moment and the person, right? So we all have these characteristic ways of responding. So, becoming calm, mindful, and reflective allows us to move towards others with genuine curiosity and to inquire with genuine interest and take in what others say. The antidotes to feeling threatened are to act in ways that are calm and mindful and to create conditions for others so they don't feel threatened. Now, this is a two-way interaction. I always think of this as kind of there was a show called Columbo, and so we call it the Columbo technique. It's like I'm so curious, and I've had to use this in times when I really felt activated. I remember everything happens on the soccer field for me. A parent who I really like was started complaining about having to wear masks. Was saying, I just hate the governor. And I was just like, what is going on here? And then I just said, stop, do what you preach. And I said, so I'm curious, Columbo technique, why do you hate him? And he stopped. He stopped, literally stopped, because I don't think he'd ever been asked that question. And so, and he thought, he's like, well, I hate the way he speaks as a public speaker. And I'm like, okay, everyone has their preferences of what they like in a public speaker. But his next piece really surprised me because I assumed that something about him that didn't come up. He said, I want him to be more direct and tell us exactly what to do. And I said, oh, he didn't want the no mask. He wanted more control. And so that opened up such an interesting conversation about leadership. So we started talking about leadership, like what kind of, leaders. I go, so I said, yeah, as I've explored leadership, it's a lot harder than I thought. And what do you like about leaders? And so he started sharing, and we were talking. Rather than my initial reaction was to argue with him, defend the governor, and defend whatever, I don't know. But I was just, again, triggered by the whole mask thing because of my history, which I already shared, right? So it was just a moment that, again, awakened in me surprise that I can still learn, still grow in that moment. So the next set, I would say, and is kind of this interpersonal skill set. Okay. Oh boy, we all have different worldviews. We have different experiences, beliefs, and values. And I hear often, how could they believe that? How could they think that? Right? And we try to make sense of it. I get very curious by that. It's the way I survive. Curiosity helps me not feel defeated. Curiosity helps me to feel hopeful. And that's just my technique. That doesn't mean that I ignore injustice. Okay, so it's not all relative. It says, I understand that you've had these experiences that have made you feel this way. Doesn't mean I agree with it. Okay, I remember working my friend, she was a therapist and had to work in the prison system. And her first client was a white supremacist nationalist. And her supervisor said, you need to find something to connect with him on. And she's Latina, young, and just said, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And through many conversations, she said there was a trauma story that he had. And we were able to connect with his trauma, his hurt, and through time, they developed a very strong therapeutic relationship. But that took a lot of work on her part, a lot of feeling very vulnerable, and she had to get her own support system in that process. I'm not saying we all have to do that. That was just part of her job, and she was learning how to navigate that. We all have different styles of communication, different forms of speaking, different ways we listen. Okay, so speaking, I don't know how many of you come from a loud family, but there's great gradations of loudness, right? I remember taking my nephew over to my friend's house in high school, and they were the Syracuses, and they're a very Italian family. And he looked at me and he's like, Thea, he said, they're really loud. And I said, yeah. He's like, why are they so mad? I said, they're not mad. They're not mad. They're just talking to each other. And so we have to really think about when we hear loud, when I hear loud, am I thinking mad? Because it's not always the case, right? Loud can look so different for different people. And listening is a hard skill to learn because having done couples therapy, listening usually is the first thing that goes out the window of really hearing. So one of the techniques I'll use is just saying back what I heard. So you're saying, and this is what I did with the guy about the governor. I said, so what you're saying is you would prefer someone who's very clear and tell everyone exactly what to do. And he's like, yeah, and so we expanded the conversation. So listening is about also making sure you're understanding, right? That I really want to understand. I'm not listening, trying to develop my counterattack. It's listening to understand. I think we have to acknowledge that something called attributional bias. Attribution theory assumes that usually when we're confronted with a situation that is, we're trying to figure out, our brains automatically try to figure out what's the cause of what we're encountering, okay? And this decision about the cause then impacts our emotional and behavioral reactions. Unfortunately, there's the ultimate attribution error, which sometimes when we're confronted with ambiguous, vague situations, we tend to make attributions that are consistent with our own prejudices. Okay, so when we see something confusing and we don't know the cause, the ultimate attributional error is to place the cause, make the attribution that are consistent with our prejudices. And that's hard to know. We're not going to figure that out often on our own. We're going to have to rely on people close to us to point that out to us. Or we have to rely on our own reading of materials or what have you that are different than our own beliefs or in our own comfort zone to help us point out what are our attributional biases. And when someone points out, hey, I don't know about that. I don't know about what you're saying, Carrie. I get excited. That's just another way I cope. I'm like, wow, I didn't realize that. Thank you so much for pointing that out. I remember doing a presentation in GSEP where I said, I was reading something out of Azusa Pacific, and it was a spiritual piece on humility, and it was, what if everything we said we ended, but I could be wrong, right? And it was so appealing to me, that concept. And when I presented it, God bless her, the student in the PhD in the education side, PhD program said, as a Black woman, but I could be wrong, has major consequences for me in this world. And I said, oh my gosh, yes. And I get that. And I thought I really missed a piece there in her experience. And I thanked her for it instead of, so it really opened up for me a place where I needed to grow. Excuse me. Finally, this piece of processing content, I think, is very relevant. We can react to the content of our dialogues. What are the issues at hand? But the added layer is the way we're doing it, the process. How is this unfolding? How am I reading the body language of the person I'm speaking to? Are they becoming very, big? Again, our physiological response is this a fight, flight, or freeze situation? Or are they shutting down, becoming quiet? So I think I'm very interested more so in the process of this conversation. Any of us who work with families who have teens, and now that I'm raising two teenagers, I find that the driving in the car and having difficult conversations is the most effective with teenagers because there's nowhere to go. The car is maybe, but also the lack of eye contact allows for some safety for them to share some of their inner thoughts. Um, I think this process can be useful in some situations and not in others. The process, that's why I don't find social media is the best process for having difficult dialogues. The content, sometimes there's a lack of knowledge. And so I know that the current rhetoric in the mainstream media and so on is about truth and what is, what's real, what's not. And I think we do have to be critical consumers of knowledge and what this means and use that to our best, you know, to use it in our conversations as a way not to get at the other, but just use it as information in what we're talking about. Lay it out there. And how do we make sense of this? Okay, so I want to talk about different intentions. So sometimes people come to a conversation and they just want to be heard. Just listen to me, let me vent, right? And I recently did this with my mom. I go, Mom, I just want to check in. I said, are you just wanting to vent? She's like, yes, just listen, And I said, okay, I could do that, because and it's just this heard. Let me just talk, right? And then the other piece is, please validate me. Just tell me I'm not going crazy here. Tell me that I'm not the only one. That validation, and we get this often in our friend groups and so on. Sometimes people come where, please just understand me, try to understand me. And that's where, asking questions, being curious helps someone else who wants to be understood. Now, for me as a person saying, what do I need in this moment? I know certain people who are better at just the understanding part and certain people who are better at the validating part. And I just know my friends. And I know this friend might be so overwhelmed with their own stuff that they can only handle just the hearing, right? And so it's not just about knowing ourselves, but notice where are the people in our lives, okay? This is where, for many of us in different faith backgrounds, in my own Christian faith, I find this in my faith, the being heard, the being validated through scripture, with being understood. And so we can find this also in texts, right? Sometimes people find it in poetry. Oh, yeah, they felt that way too. They get me, right? Um, the other intention is I really want to understand. Sometimes I just want to understand where the person is and how they got there. Some people go into a conversation they wanting to be right and they want to win. Okay, and that's legitimate. Um, but I think knowing that and being honest about that is very important, which leads us to the next piece, which is the difference between debate versus dialogue. I never was on a debate team. Perhaps some of you were. The ultimate goal of debate is to win, right? And that's what it is. Statements are predictable. They're not. They're just trying to. It's a commitment to a point of view, approach, or idea, and the goal is to better the next person. This is different than dialogue, which is to understand, to create new information. We might have deeply held beliefs, but we also can express some uncertainties, some desire to wanting to grow. Okay. And I will say that I've noticed in some conversations that we go back and forth between these, even. It's not so linear, that what started off as a dialogue shifted into a debate. So that meant that personally, I had to say, hey, I feel like we're in debate mode right now. Is that what you're sensing? So I was talking about the process, and they said, oh, and it really slows it down a little bit. And really examining with the person I'm talking to, is this where we want to be? Is this what we want to get into right now? Some people love debate, and I think that's fine. It's just really important to distinguish between the two. I'm going through a lot of concepts, so bear with me. Another important piece that in these dialogues, sometimes we have an intention that was very different than the impact it has on the person, right? So the intention might be, I wanted to share, say I wanted to share with you an experience or a belief, and yet the impact on you was that it really hurt you. Okay. And you might say to me, wow, your words and your actions really hurt me. And underlying that is, please understand, please acknowledge and take responsibility for this. Um, and what happens sometimes is the person who offended says, oh, that wasn't my intention to hurt you with my words and actions. It says, basically, my intention is telling me that I'm a good person and a kind person. That's not what's necessary. You're bleeding there. And I just would recommend in that moment, if there's a need for an apology, consider whether you're spending more time explaining your intent rather than focusing on the impact in your apology. What does your apology look like? Is it more about you or more about the person that you hurt? And as someone who wants to connect people, I would say focus on the person that's hurt in that moment. So I want to talk a little bit about guidance from faith and spirituality. I think this is coming up a lot in conversations about polarization. People talk about when the ideas are tied to their existential well-being, it tends to be more, they fervently hold on to those ideas. So when I look at Christianity, we have these words, and in Judaism and many different faith or organizations and religions about how do we treat people and how do we figure out what is the right way to treat them. And I really think I would like to be treated with respect. I would like to be treated as a human being. So when I see a conversation where a person is being dehumanized, othered, I name it, and I say, and this isn't just about us. When I see it happening to a friend and I'm looking at the power differential, as I get more power in the world or in certain situations, it's my job as a human being, as a Christian, to say, I don't know where this is going, but it seems like we're losing their experience in this conversation. And I think if we can just take a moment, and it's an offering, it's a sense of let's calling someone in. Can we just stop a sec? I think one of the techniques to regulate those emotions, there's many techniques, but we often call it grounding ourselves. How do we ground ourselves, whether before we engage in a difficult dialogue, in the moment or afterwards? Can be through prayer, meditation. Prayer, either sacred centering prayers, meditation. There's all, I'll tell you, prayer, meditation, you can find so many apps nowadays that to help you really center and ground yourself. I do this regularly throughout the day. I find it so helpful, just as maybe 15 minutes at certain points during the day to really re-energize myself. Some talk about more ceremony or ritual in our lives. Maybe it's lighting candles. Maybe it involves prayer, but it could be something that really grounds us into the meaning of life. I think that's why you found so many people really struggling during COVID, was because when they couldn't go to certain places where they found their ceremonies and rituals. And that was very disheartening. And it was a coping skill that was taken away and needed to be for safety. People find solace and find grounding in nature, just even walking on the grass or listening and noticing. I feel fortunate now that I have a backyard that I can really just sit and look at beauty and say a prayer in that moment, or just connect. Connecting with a loved one, appreciating telling old stories. These are different ways of grounding ourselves. My favorite is engaging in the arts, whether it's through music. It just transports us to a place of connecting into ourselves, our souls, through art, dance, movement, through reading inspirational books. I also add helping others, helping people, when getting ourselves out of our own head. There's always someone who needs us, who needs our assistance. I'm really much, I just I say I'm really connected to the idea of that we are all connected, and my history um, has strong indigenous roots, and so connectedness is a big piece of that. Strengthening our roots is a big piece of that. So I like this um, verse from Jeremiah 17:8, that he's like a tree planted by water that sends out its roots by the stream and does not fear when heat comes, for its leaves remain green, and is not anxious in a year of drought, for it does not cease to bear fruit. I think when we see fear, anxiety, we're not bearing fruit, right? We're not living authentically. We're not living bravely. We're not living with the spirit, right? And so I just think this is reminding me that when I'm feeling the fear and anxiety, while that is very much important for me to know what's causing this and what do I need to do about it, it also tells me, like, what do I need to do about it? Who do I need to turn to? Where can I find this? How can I pray about it? All of this helps me as information for me that I need to move to a place of thriving and not just living in fear. Now, that is all I have, but I just wanted to end with some thoughts. I'm sure you have some questions, some thoughts to consider for yourself. Maybe you like to journal. How are you strengthening your roots for future difficult dialogues? What helps you feel brave? What helps you? And how often are you calling in others versus calling them out? I really like this reframe of calling out culture, just saying, let's call into, we can be the activists. I grew up as an activist for my family, but we can be the calling in for change and dialogue as well. So I'm going to end with that. And thank you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Castaneda Sound. I just appreciate you so much, your expertise and just the beautiful way that you delivered all of this information, which can seem like an onslaught, but it's just so needed for all of us. And I think each of us can see ourselves in one of those pieces, but also can see ways in which we can grow. So definitely love that Columbo technique. We'll be using that in the future. And there's just the notion of seeking to understand rather than, to just to hear or to listen. So with that, I'm going to open up the chat. If anyone has a question that they would like to propose, or if you would like to raise your hand in the feature of Zoom. But I will get us started as we wait for those to come in. Building upon the interpersonal and kind of that idea of intent versus impact. What does your experience within your research say for those that might hear something in a way that is piercing? And clearly we're responsible for the words that come out of our mouth and the intent that lands, but then, there's others, which I will say for myself within the context of my marriage. So my husband will say something and I'm going to take it in a more sensitive nature. And I think a lot of times I'll say, if you would have said it this way, it would have, landed in such a way. So where do we, together grow, the person that's saying it, but also I'm asking for myself, how do I grow in that receiving of dialogue?
Right. I think, I really like the work of Renee Brown. Have you read some of her work? And she has this approach where she says, the story I'm creating in my mind about this is that X, Y, or Z. So, the way you said that, the story I'm creating in my mind is that you're really mad at me or something. And is that true? Right. And checking it out. I think for me, and that's much easier to do, I think, with people I know well. I think in a work setting, it is checking out. Sometimes we have to be able to read social cues too, which is something that is not always easy. As we get to know people, we can read them better. But I think sometimes we have to say, you know, just a bad day, or how are you doing? Checking in with them with a sense of compassion, right? Um, I saw a question here. What methods do you recommend for de-escalating difficult conversations that have become quite heated? Mary, that's a great question. And I think sometimes it's an assessment in the moment of, is this something that needed to happen? Do we need to get through this? Or are we just so afraid of the heat that we need to put the fire out? So there, I will say I'm not perfect at it, but sometimes um, I'll stop and let's take a break for a second. Let's just take a deep breath, and then we'll talk about the process. And you know, as someone watching, so that's a different place. As someone watching, I'll say, let's just take a break real quick and take some deep breaths, and just say, and talk about the process. What just happened here? Now, because I'm more familiar with doing this, if that's me in a conversation, I can notice it and say it too. Um, but being the one that takes care of other people's feelings in itself is exhausting as well. So I will say that even being the one watching the heated dialogue, you need to kind of take care of yourself afterwards as well. But I think the different ways, I will say, first of all, how comfortable am I witnessing a difficult dialogue? And it's gotten heated, because not all heated, escalated conversations are always bad. And that's the first thing. So we have to know, where is our tolerance for this? Is there a way out? I think for me, some of the things that are cues that it's gotten pretty bad is when people are attacking the other person on the personal side. And that's when I say, let's just take a break and take a deep breath and really examine, is this where we want to be right here? Is this where we want this? And so it's an inviting in a conversation about, how do we want this to go in this moment?
Do you see any of those actions being different based upon relationships? So you said, you know, oftentimes we enter into conversations differently. We have a relationship with the other individual versus being unfamiliar or not having a basis. Is that de-escalating shift at all between those with whom we have a relationship and those that we may not have kind of that platform or that basis?
Right. If it gets pretty heated at work, I think there's different types of consequences, right? And so I think we have to also be mindful of professionalism. What is, you know, the space for this? How do we balance that? When it's at home, I'm always balancing the consequences in terms of, usually I have an emotional lens. So I have an 80-year-old mother who, her health is very important to me. And so if I see it getting heated between my brothers, you know, I'll say, hey, let's either move this somewhere else, or, you know, this is going to take a toll on her. So if it's between me, I'm often thinking about what is going to be the impact, because she now is so fearful that we'll never talk to each other after she passes. And I'm just like, Mom, we're gonna have a relationship. But I do think it looks different in different settings. But I think one technique to name the process and just even invite a break, take a deep breath, cool off, can be another piece.
So another question in the chat is from Natasha. The notion of agreeing to disagree, does that really work, or is that more of a cop-out that we should perhaps go for the more difficult or larger conversation?
Right. Now I just want to check, can you hear me better?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, I think I didn't really have time to talk about patience. Agreeing to disagree is one point in time. I think that means that it doesn't mean to me, what that says is the conversation hasn't started and it's not over. Both. That this person is not in a place where they really want to talk it through. You know, I used to work in Salt Lake City, Utah as a therapist. And I remember having parents come in, two parents in particular, that said, our 8-year-old boy is gay and we want you to make him straight. And And I thought, well, I can get mad at them, or I can sit with them to understand what their concern is. And as I sat with them, I said, tell me about what's going on here. Why do you want to do this? And they explained their religious belief system. And then I said, tell me about more about that. What it came down to is their fears. And when we got down to the emotion, we were having true dialogue. And then I told them that honestly, the research doesn't support what you're asking for. In fact, it shows that it's more harmful to people. And that's what I can tell you right now is the research shows that there's more suicidality, more depression, more anxiety by trying to change someone and their sexual orientation. That was hard for them to hear. And I said, but this is what I can offer. I can help you through this process. I can talk to you in ways to affirm you and that you can affirm your son. Because of course I could work with the son, but I knew that I would help him more by working with the parents. Fortunately, through the process of listening to them, by the time I gave the message of what I could offer, they were more open to it. But if I had started off with, the research shows this doesn't work, I can't help you, that's it, I would have shut the door on a conversation that was much more open to hearing their fears, right? And their fears were much more religious in terms of the afterlife, right? So here, we're talking about multiple levels here. So what I think of the agreeing to disagree is, I feel like, yes, in some ways it's a cop-out, but I think there's so much more to it. I would be curious about why don't they want to engage in a discussion about this? What is threatening to them, right? What could be taken away if they change their view? What could be taken away if I had to change my view? What is the threat? I know my mom will say to me, Carrie, I just can't debate you because you will talk circles around me. I'm not as smart as you. And it broke my heart. I started crying because I never would want my mom to say that. But with education comes some level of power, and my family didn't go to college. And so she just said, I can't talk to you about this because I just get all flustered. Right. And that brought me down to a place of, well, I love you and I want to connect with you. Again, I have to go to the heart connection with the people I care about. It is harder with people that we don't know well, but I just feel like, what are we trying to do here? What is our purpose? What is our shared goal? We often hear in a lot of, you read in the mediation literature about what are the shared values, the shared goals. And I think in Pepperdine, we talk about these shared values, shared goals, and we need to constantly revisit that and how that translates to actions and behaviors. Right? So that can happen in all different types of life. What kind of family do we want? You know, we could say we want a family that talks and talks things out, but how does that look? How can we practice it? Thank you for that question.
Sierra, about the timing of difficult conversations. If you know a conversation needs to happen, is there any type of internal checklist or, pre-game thought process that you need to make sure to have to be ready?
Right. I think I I feel like I'm back to raising a baby, but for myself, it's like I can't be hungry. I have to have good sleep. I mean, if I can control those basic needs, I'm good. But I think also in a place, and again, I'm thinking of people I've interacted with and egos, is if there's a threat that their ego is, if they're going to be embarrassed in some way, or, sometimes you can't take care of everyone and there's no perfection. I think for me, I avoid holidays and get-togethers, Thanksgiving, Christmas, that's off the table in terms of doing this for my mom's sake. And so we just have these internal rules. I don't think it's the same for everyone, but those basic needs are important as well as context. Do we have enough time to get through this? do we both agree to engage in a way? Is there this, not verbally always, but do we really want to go there? Is there energy around it?
Dr. Castaneda-Sound, are there any other thoughts? I know you left us with 3 great questions. Kind of brave is one that's sitting on my heart, but is there any other final closing thoughts that you'd like to share with our group?
Yeah, I just want to have a spirit of gratitude and thank you all for wanting to do this work. I think it is work. I think it's also the benefits, I think, are so worth it, of deepening our relationships. I think it can be part of the work, the advocacy I do, part of the advocacy I do is to connect with people before, and to be able to share some insights. That connection is key. Yeah, I think that's really important.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, ladies, if you would join me either silently or unmute yourselves in thanking Dr. Castaneda-Sound for being with us this morning, for her preparation and just for sharing with us her wisdom and practice.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.